The infection had reached Kingsmouth Island during the night, and by morning I could already see infected stumbling about on the street outside. There wasn't much in the holiday bungalow, but I found a knife and a meat cleaver. I didn't have the tools to board the place up, so I knew I would have to do something much more dangerous. Stepping out the front door, I saw the first of the infected in the flesh. It was covered in wounds and groaning piteously. Killing it felt wrong, but I knew I had to do it. There was no time to grieve either, as there were more in the area. The meat cleaver made an awful noise sinking into his skull. I chanced upon a fellow police officer in the woods. They were infected too. Once I dealt with them, I searched the body. They had a gun, a nightstick, and a bulletproof vest. I took them all. I wasn't sure if the vest would be of any use, but better safe than sorry. Certainly hadn't helped them. Over the past few days I'd met many of these people, if only in passing. It made the grim work even more disturbing. While the infected were violent, aggressive, they were also slow, uncoordinated. They would trip over things. I could push them over fairly easily. I could fight several at once if I had to, and I would have to, but I'd get tired pretty quickly. They did seem to be attracted to noises, so I held off on firing the gun for now. I retreated to my bungalow once the sun went down. I was covered in blood. I'd spent the whole day just going up and down the street, clearing out infected as I found them. By my count, I'd had to kill 47 of them already. I still couldn't board the place up. The best I could do was stay quiet and hope they didn't see me during the night. It shouldn't have been any surprise that I had trouble sleeping. I spent a few hours reloading that gun, just trying to keep my mind off things. I got up a lot later than usual. Bodies still littered the street outside. So I got right back into it, going house to house, taking out as many infected as I could. I knew there was a resort to the south that had thousands and thousands of people in it. If they'd all become infected, even a small portion walking this way would be way more than I could handle. While clearing out one of the nearby bungalows, I found a hand axe. My improvised weapons were breaking quickly, so I had to keep my eye out for whatever I could find. The nightstick was pretty durable, but so was a human skull. All 9 of these bungalows were virtually identical, and they gave me very little to work with. By midday, I must have looked as gory as the infected. I was getting more confident at fighting small groups, but it was exhausting. While fighting with a small group, I found another infected police officer. This one had a shotgun slung over his shoulders. It wouldn't do me much good unless I also found a few boxes of ammunition. For now, I didn't want to know how many of these things might show up if I actually fired that shotgun. For the moment, it seemed safer to stick to hand-to-hand combat, but I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. At best, I was treading water. The power was still on, so that night I made a point of cooking all the meat I'd found in the nearby bungalows. I had trouble sleeping again, unsurprisingly. I ended up downing a beer before I could get to bed. I hadn't killed 100 of these things yet, but I was pretty sure I was going to break that milestone tomorrow. I made a point of getting up earlier the next day. Fog had rolled in, and I was concerned that these things might sneak up on me. The street outside was littered with corpses, but I could see more and larger packs coming into the area. I knew sheltering in place was out of the question. I knew I couldn't keep just doing the same thing over and over. I was slowly building up a stockpile of weapons, but there were a bunch of other things I needed to keep an eye out for as well. I'd cleared to both ends of the street now. That was as far as I'd come in 2 days. It was hard to tell for sure in the fog, but it looked like there were a lot more of these things to the south. Even now, they were slowly making their way up through the woods. finally, one of the unfortunate infected was carrying a bag. That would be useful. I knew I had to get out of here, and to do so, I was going to have to carry my food with me. There were too many infected to the south. The north was blocked off by a barbed wire fence. To the west was the ocean, so I could really only go east. But before I could do that, I wanted to get my hands on a bunch of tools. I'd finally made it down to the third line of bungalows. There were definitely more infected down there. I headed north again, and spent the next few hours doing my best to make sure the area around my bungalow was clear. I still had made no attempts to fortify the place. It wasn't really suitable for that. I was pretty sure I only had 1 or 2 more days before I had to get out of here. I already had more stuff than I could carry, but it wasn't the right stuff. Today I had a plan. I'd seen some buildings under construction down by the wharf. It was far enough away from the main resort that it might not be too occupied, and it seemed like a good place to get my hands on some tools. I decided to take a television with me, because I really didn't want to miss my favorite carpentry show. Don't question it. I had to leave the road. I was going to make my way along the beach towards the wharf. There had been some infected wandering the forest, but not too many. As I got closer to the wharf, I found there were indeed more infected. Hopefully it wasn't more than I could handle. One of the dead was carrying a larger bag, so we upgraded. Sneaking into the construction site, I was pleased to find it was lightly guarded. Now this room only had one way in and one way out, so if we got swarmed, we would be in real trouble. As expected, the crates proved to be a gold mine of weapons, and my carpentry show was enjoyable as always. There was way more stuff here than I could carry, so I grabbed only the most important items and left. Heading down onto the pier itself, I thought I'd check some of the shipping containers. It was eerily quiet out here. I found some more tools, and even some seeds. That could be useful. I didn't want 100 of these things following me home, so I did my best to give them the slip in the forest. Our street looked quiet, save for the buzzing of flies. I'm sure there are a few infected hiding around the place, but we should be safe for one more night. I'd packed as much as I could carry, and today the plan was to get the hell out of here. We had to go across the driving range, through the woods, across a park, and over a bridge, and there would probably be hundreds of infected along the way. I found a second duffel bag and decided to upgrade. I left a lot of my stuff behind while I scouted ahead. This was the fence separating the resort from the military airfield that dominated the north of the island. I could almost smell the guns in that guard tower, but I just couldn't get there right now. So far, the infected were at a manageable number, but it looked like there were more up ahead. Fortunately, we'd gotten pretty good at taking them out, even in groups of 3 or 4. I wanted the park to be as clear as possible for when I hauled all my stuff through here, but I knew I couldn't take all day. I was getting tired as well. After taking out the infected, I doubled back for my extra duffel bag. I would need the food and the tools to have any chance of making it on my own. I snuck through the park, through the woods, and made my way down to the bridge separating the two halves of the island. This is the half the locals live on, and it's much less populated than the resort. I'd seen a map indicating an old cabin in the woods. I hoped that it was a good place to hold up and catch my breath. So far, the plan was just to not die. Anything more complicated than that would have to wait. The island was small, but not that small. It was large enough to have dozens of these things on it, but for the moment it looks like I was getting lucky. I had plenty of time before it got dark as well. I would make a thorough sweep of the woods around the cabin. No point in being quiet now. If there's anything here, I want it to come out and find me. Walking around the island shouting, I found a few more infected that have been hiding out. I just hope I found them all. Each one I kill I hope is the last, but it'll take a while before I feel actually safe. Using that hand axe I found, I fell a few trees and make some crude barricade over the bridge. It wouldn't stop a normal person, but these infected are not that coordinated. It is definitely not indestructible, but it might be enough to convince them to go somewhere else. Dropping off my stuff in the cabin, I decided to make one more sweep of the island, and got lucky. Hopefully, that was the last one. Not trusting to luck, I decided to board up the windows as best I could. Not wanting to slip out into the dark forest to get some wood, I decided to disassemble some of the furniture. It seemed like the safer option. It was past midnight before I got to bed, and I was looking forward to not dying tomorrow. Now that I had a little breathing room, I decided to plant some of the seeds I found back at the warehouse. The cabin was a mess, especially after all the furniture we'd disassembled, but it'd do for now. Shovel in hand, I headed out to have a look at the nearby area. I was not at all surprised to find infected. Did everyone on the island turn? Just as I'd guessed, the number of infected on this side of the island seemed much lower, perhaps more manageable. I decided to sneak into the nearest house. I could always use more food. After being fairly certain I was alone, I made straight for the fridge. There wasn't much there. But man cannot live on food alone. He also needs a carpentry TV show. When I saw that it was raining, I decided to plant some more of the seeds I found. It would save time. If I really was the last person on the island, then there'd be enough food in the local supermarket to last maybe a year. It made sense to think long term. Sitting and watching my carpentry show, I realized that the power wouldn't stay on forever. I had seen a generator back on the pier, but that was a long way away. Finally feeling like I had some breathing room, I stopped to shave. It was still raining outside, so I figured I'd take it easy for the day. I watched the little TV, making sure to catch my favorite carpentry show. I didn't know how much longer I'd have the power for. After lunch, I went out and explored the small island. I kept my eyes open for anything that might be useful, but most of all, I was making damn sure that I was alone out here. As the hours rolled on, it was looking increasingly likely that I was. While foraging, I heard a helicopter pass overhead. Even if I'd managed to signal it, it couldn't land anywhere near here, and that was assuming it had peaceful intentions. I couldn't begin to guess if it had come from a nearby island, or if someone had escaped from the airfield to the north. As I paced back and forth inside the cabin, I realized the helicopter was circling. It wasn't escaping the island, it was scouting it out. By morning, the weather had cleared up. After taking yesterday off, I wasn't looking forward to getting back to the grisly work, but I couldn't let the infected stack up around the bridge to the island. Even if they might have trouble with my little barricade, I didn't want to imagine what would happen if 200 of these things just stood at the end of the bridge waiting for me. It had been more than a week since the infection hit the island, and the sick were not slowing down. I hadn't seen any of them drinking, and rarely even eating, and some of them were still shambling around with the most grievous of wounds. I began to seriously reconsider everything the news had said. Maybe these people weren't sick at all. Maybe they weren't even people anymore. As I moved from target to target, covered in their gore, it helped to think of them as monsters. I went into another house, though I greatly preferred fighting these things outside. It would be so easy to get tangled up on the furniture, or have a dozen of these things swarm in after me. I guess I got lucky this time that there weren't that many nearby. Across the street there was some sort of warehouse. If I was lucky, it might even be holding some overflow from the nearby military base. There are infected outside and infected inside. Hopefully not too many. I certainly wasn't going in quietly. Inside, there were just a handful of infected moving around. Fighting these things one or two at a time didn't seem like much of a challenge anymore. I snuck up behind one of them and stabbed them so hard their pants changed colour. That was weird. I resisted the urge to check any of the crates before I'd fully cleared the building. It wasn't late in the day, but I was already getting tired. There was a small office upstairs. I'd clear that and then I'd call it a day. I stole the microwave and a few other items. I'd check the place more carefully tomorrow. The microwave might be useful, but only until the power went out. In the morning, I found infected trying to get through the barricade. I cleared one out with my revolver, but I thought it best to try to take the rest out in hand-to-hand combat. The trees made it hard for me to see exactly how many I was facing. This little dirt path was already getting quite the collection of corpses. There were new infected in the area, but their numbers were limited. I cleared a few out before deciding to scout a little further. Not far off, and I was already finding them in larger groups. I found the local gas station. There was a large pack of infected nearby, but I could sneak in and steal a little bit of gasoline. Even just a bottle's worth would be enough to let me power up the next generator I found, if only for a few minutes. Past the gas station was a surprisingly large school. So far I'd been able to sneak my way between packs of infected. Heading back through the factory, I found some infected had made their way inside. I wanted to head back to the cabin, but I couldn't let any of these things follow me. If there was anyone else alive on the island, I'd figure I'd just have to look for a trail of corpses. I certainly wouldn't be hard to follow. Returning to the cabin, I stopped for a quick lunch, dropped a few items off, and headed back out. My only plan was to scout out the area and push back any infected who got too close to my island. The warehouse was large and porous. I would have trouble keeping the infected out. I spotted a moderate amount of infected down the street, but I thought I could handle it. Rather than take them on head first, I decided to try to shake them around a building. Now with the small pack more broken up, I was able to move in and take them out one by one. I'd made my way down to the third building on the street, and it was time to check it out. Empty, unfortunately. I only had a couple of hours before it got dark, and I wasn't going to wander around out here in the dark. House number 4 was at least occupied. Fresh food in the fridge reminded me that this nightmare hadn't really been going on that long. It felt like a long time. On my way out, I spotted a propane tank in the barbecue. That could be useful. It was heavy, but I took it with me. By morning, a thick fog had rolled in, so I busied myself around the cabin. It was nearly noon before the fog abated. Today I wanted to clear that warehouse again and actually check the boxes. Every day it seemed like more infected showed up to replace the ones I'd killed. I checked on the bridge that led back to the other half of the island. There was a large group of infected loitering there. I'd have to do something about that. Maybe I could break it or block it up somehow. I was getting more confident in taking these things out, but it wasn't risk-free, and I knew one mistake and I would be bitten. Some of the infected that had made it across the bridge hid themselves in the woods. I had to seek them out one by one. Now the bulk of the group rushed me all at once. I tried to break up their formation by circling around a burnt-out van. It had been enough to give me the edge. Another police officer, another shotgun. I should really try to get my hands on some shotgun shells. With the bridge clear, for now, I went back into the warehouse. For whatever reason, several infected had made their way inside to just stand around. After sneaking up on one of the infected, I realized that the woman was missing most of her face. These things weren't human. Not anymore. With the warehouse quiet at last, I got back to looking around. More rooms full of crates. Much of what they held was useless. I did find a dumbbell. That might be useful at some point. I found some more tools that I could use as weapons. I took the tools that were in better condition and left the rest. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but it wasn't far to the cabin, so I tried to take everything that might be useful. I found a package of cabbage seeds. That would be useful. I still had an hour or so before sundown, but I decided to head back to the cabin. I dropped off most of the tools. Out in the garden, I thought it best to get those cabbages in the ground as soon as possible. I'd never farmed before, but it seemed easy enough. Fortunately, the plants were happy to get water straight from the ocean. Don't question it. The next day, the weather was bad, so I just stayed around the cabin. It did give me the idea that I should get my hands on some more books, though. Home improvement type books. I'd seen the school a few days ago. It had to have a library. I did find some infected out on the street, but they were headed the other way in quite a hurry, so I let them go. Once again, the bridge was inhabited. And the warehouse, would there be fresh infected inside? Yes. I'd caught one waiting to ambush me as I came through the doors. Was it luck, or some remnant of intelligence? I slipped past a few groups of zombies and made my way to the school. I hoped there weren't hundreds of these things inside. I tried to lure out the few that I could see. It helped to remind myself that these weren't people anymore. The school was surprisingly quiet, a little eerie if anything. I snuck up on one of the infected, but they didn't go down quietly. Fortunately, the library was right here. If I could just do this quietly. Was I in luck? There was just a single infected inside. If I could lure them away from the window. It seemed like I had the place to myself, but I didn't want to stay long. I could have started just sweeping shelves into my bag, but for now I figured I'd look for the most important texts. And that meant a little bit of everything. My best find was probably a magazine that would tell me which berries I could eat. That could come in handy. With my raid done, I made my way back to the cabin and started reading. Fishing, foraging, carpentry, there were a lot of skills that suddenly seemed a lot more useful. I wasn't going to hide out here forever, but for now I'd bide my time. I decided to take the next day off, or at least to just stay around the cabin and read. There were quite a few of these self-help books that I needed to get through. It was a nice change of pace. Almost pleasant, in fact. Unfortunately, I'd always been a slow reader. Still, what did I have but time? The streets were quiet, for a change. I'd gotten tired of clearing wandering infected out of the warehouse, so I figured I might kill two birds with one stone. Disassembling the crates would give me materials to board up the windows. And it didn't hurt to practice my carpentry skills a little. The barricades wouldn't keep the infected out forever, but it might be enough to stop them just casually strolling in. As I moved to the next window, one of the infected got back up. It had been missing half its brain when it stood up. I dealt with the other half. It was just more evidence that these weren't infected people anymore. They were zomboids. Nah, I'll come up with something better. While working in the warehouse, I'd used up all the tips and tricks I'd read about in my carpentry book. I decided to head home to read the next one. It was raining pretty hard, so I decided I'd do a little bit more farming. Farming was hard work, but much more pleasant than smashing a skull with a shovel. I hadn't found the local supermarket yet, but I thought my little farm was going okay. Taking the rest of the day off, I washed and I shaved again. It felt good to try to keep things as normal as possible. It had been almost 2 weeks since the outbreak, and I must have killed hundreds of those things by now. While the rain continued to wash away all the blood, I got down to studying the next carpentry text. It took all night. After a nap, I headed back out through the storm, intent on heading to the warehouse. I picked right up where I left off yesterday, disassembling crates and boarding up windows. I wasn't trying to turn this place into a fortress, just to make it more inconvenient for infected to wander in. Those cardboard boxes would be of less use. My hammering must have attracted one of the creatures. It was late, later than I thought, but I didn't want to give it all night to tear its way into the warehouse. It was still light enough for me to go outside and deal with it. I was extra careful as I made my way home in the dark. I still had to worry about being followed back to the island. The farm was coming along nicely, but nothing was table ready yet. The plan for today was the same as it had been, to head back to the warehouse. On the way back to the warehouse, I spotted more of these zomboids out on the street. So far, my impromptu barricades seem to have held, and I only had a few more windows to board up. I got back to work disassembling crates. I found a crate filled with musical instruments, but I had no time for such levity. As I continued to practice my carpentry, a banging on the window alerted me to a creature outside. Moving through the warehouse, I was again ambushed by one of the dead zomboids. I'm glad I buried the ones that were out on my island. Heading back inside, I made my way upstairs to disassemble what little was left in the warehouse. Another day, and with it, knowledge. Along with carpentry, I'd read an electrical book, even if that was only something I meant to dabble in. With the island's main power offline, I figured it might come in handy. I'd finished with the warehouse, so today I'd need to start heading into the nearby houses. First things first. A half-dozen zomboids out on the street wasn't a problem. As soon as I stepped into a house, things would get more dicey. It occurred to me I hadn't even found signs of other people boarding their houses up. Had they all gotten sick at exactly the same time? Had it been that fast? Heading upstairs, my main concern was what might come up behind me, but I couldn't forget about the zomboid right in front of me. These things were pretty noisy, but I still felt the need to check every nook and cranny. After disassembling some more furniture, I headed across the street. I hadn't been into any of these houses yet, so I was expecting infected. I maybe wasn't expecting just how many came out of this house. I could still hear more inside. It occurred to me that these people weren't laid out like they'd been sick. They were all still wearing their shoes. Whatever happened hit them before they could even retreat to their sick beds. Maybe I'd find some more information in the hospital. The house had quite a bit of food in it. With the power out, that would become increasingly rare. I started to make my way back to the cabin, but I stopped on the way. I figure I could do the same with these houses as I'd done with the warehouse, so I started ripping apart the furniture and boarding up the windows. It was dark before I was finished, but I was just a stone's throw away from the bridge and safety. Things had begun to settle into a bit of a grind over the last few days, but perhaps I shouldn't have let myself get complacent. It was a grim task working around the rotting remains of the island's inhabitants. This was an island though, so I figured eventually I could clear it. Boarding up all these houses would give the infected less place to hide. On my way to the next house, I found another Zomboid hiding in the unusually temperate-looking tropical jungle around the town. So long as I saw them first, there was very little danger. The house was clear, and it would stay that way if I could board it up. I gave all the dead a bit of a poke, but none of them seemed to want to rise up and attack me. As with the warehouse, the goal wasn't to keep the infected out forever, but the boards on the windows would make it clear if any infected broke their way in. I'd reached the end of the row of houses. It was time to cross the street again. I'd already killed 5 Zomboids in this house, but I thought I could hear something upstairs. The fight had been unusually fast and frenzied, and in the course of it one of the creatures had bit me. Checking myself, I found the police vest had saved my life. It had been a close call, and I couldn't help but think what would have happened if 2 or 3 more creatures had come up the stairs while I was distracted. I would have to be much more careful fighting in buildings, especially heading upstairs. As I calmed down, I boarded up the windows. Maybe it was a waste of time, but it gave me something to do. It felt like a mission. It was late. I was tired, and I wanted to get back to the safety of my little island. Come morning, I pored over my map and updated it to reflect the latest houses I'd searched. It wasn't much. I felt like I wasn't moving fast enough. I just needed a little more time. One more day might be enough. Maybe just one more house. It looks like more Zomboids had crossed over onto my side of the island. I definitely wanted the streets clear before I went into any more houses. There were even more of them waiting on the other side of the bridge. I'd seen how large the resort on Kingsmouth Island was. Their numbers must be almost endless. I made a point of circling the first house before I went inside, catching a Zomboid hiding out in the trees. His friend almost caught me. First house on a new street. It seemed quiet. As I made my way upstairs, I could hear, not breathing, but moaning. through diligence, I'd found a Zomboid hiding in the closet. With the house secure, I started ripping apart the furniture. I was getting pretty good at this. I went downstairs to begin boarding the place up. And that was that. I'd exhausted the knowledge of another one of my carpentry self-help books. And now I could proceed with the next step of my plan. But first, I could use my newfound carpentry skills to make a big improvement to my little cabin. I knocked up a staircase, which let me get onto the roof. Careful not to fall off, I built a space to hold a water collector. With the river and ocean nearby, I wasn't reliant on rain, but it would be convenient. A little work downstairs, and once again I had water running out of the taps. I just had to fill the water collector up with a few barrels of water. Now I had a source of purified water to go along with my farm. It was a good day, especially after the mess of the day before. I celebrated by cooking up a big stew. Okay, it was mostly just beans, and I was too tired to cook it, but the bourbon made it palatable. I'd actually lost quite a lot of weight since this all began. I'd have to keep a closer eye on that. I awoke the next morning to find that my cabbages had grown. The farming book I'd read said I should wait till they were seed bearing, so I did just that. While getting ready to head into town, I decided to discard the damaged bulletproof vest. It had almost certainly saved my life, and I'd have to keep an eye out for another one. By the time I made my way off the island, a strong rain had set in. It looked like it might get worse, but I wanted to get at least something done. I checked the bridge, and seeing it was clear, I decided to set my sights on a nearby house. Before I could go in, I had to give the area a good scout. More and more these infected showed signs of their unliving nature. The area around the house was clear, but the heavy rain made it hard to hear if there was anything moving around inside. There was. Fortunately, the Zomboid was more than eager to come out to me. I was finding more rotten food than fresh, though I did find a ham that wasn't too far gone. I was getting too skinny, and I needed to eat more. The house sounded clear, but I couldn't trust that. Upstairs, I found a huge supply of cardboard boxes with all manner of things inside. There was mechanics tools, fishing gear, warm weather gear. It was quite the find. After checking the rest of the house, I simply didn't feel like boarding it up, so I just made my way back to the cabin. The next morning was thickly fogged, so I spent a few hours reading. It was almost relaxing. Today, the plan was to head further into town than I had before, and I knew that meant fighting my way there. I knew I was more vulnerable without my armor. During the fight, I snapped my shovel over one of the Zomboid's heads. I needed to keep closer track of the condition of my weapons. I made it to the end of the road, and the next street ran the length of the town. It looked strangely quiet. While keeping an eye out for zomboids, I spotted a car key lying on the ground. I was never a very good driver, but if I could get a car working, that would have to help. I'd even found a gas can yesterday, although I wasn't carrying it now. I had to fight up a few more zomboids before I could check the car. Check of the trunk found another empty gas can. Now if I could just find some gas in one of these nearby cars, I'd be set. The car didn't look like it was in great condition, but now that I'd moved a little gas into it, it should run. Well, that was the hope. Success. The engine groaned to life and we were off. The car couldn't hope to slip unnoticed past the packs of wandering zomboids. I'd have to be careful not to lead them all back to my island. I decided to leave the car in the warehouse. I had a mechanic's book back in the cabin, and I'd need to put some work into the car before it was of much use to me. So I just worked on it for the rest of the day. As I was preparing to leave the island, I caught a group of zomboids migrating past the bridge. I thought it better to finish them off now than to let them hide themselves away in the jungle. I had big plans for the day, but keeping this area clear was always top priority. I still hadn't sealed up the bridge to the other side of the island. That was something I would have to get around to. With the two bridges clear, I made my way down to the other end of the street. This time, rather than heading north to follow the road, I went south. The plan was to try to avoid the worst of the zomboids by moving along the beach. It would be by far the longest trip I'd taken since fleeing my holiday bungalow. For all I knew, the storm winds could have blown the zomboids up against one side of the island or the other. If things got too bad, I would turn back. There was a constant, low-level trickle of zomboids coming out of the jungle. But at least they weren't coming in large groups. Still, the difficulty of fighting amongst the trees made even moderate-sized groups far more dangerous. I backed away, using my pipe to keep them at bay. One of the zomboids blindsided me, and I got tangled up on the shoreline. I escaped injury just by the skin of their teeth. Moving off to more open area, I stood and made ready to face the zomboids again. I was more than halfway there, and hoping that the infestation didn't get any worse. I spent as much time watching the tree line as I did the bloodthirsty monsters. I was almost there. In the distance I could see the container freight station. There were just a few more zomboids between me and it. This was it, and the chain link fence should stymie any zomboids that tried to follow me. I still had no idea how many infected would be in the terminal. At least I was away from all those damn trees. It looked fairly clear, but there were a few infected hanging around. I checked some of the unloaded cargo. A crowbar was an excellent find. With that, I might be able to do something about that bridge. I was as interested in the crates themselves as what they contained. Using my newfound carpentry skills, I quickly tore them apart. Before the outbreak, I'd been talking to one of the local cops, and he told me about a large shipment of guns that were held up in customs. If they were still here, then that might really turn the tide. I set up some rudimentary defenses, but it was getting late, very late, so I decided to start the long journey home. We'd be back tomorrow. Even with all the zomboids dead, the trip along the beach was more nerve-wracking. The shadows lengthened and it felt like there were teeth hiding behind every tree. Fortunately, I had thought to pack a torch. By the time we made it back to the road, the night was dark and we were getting tired. I really didn't want any of these things following me home, but my ability to check was severely limited. It was midday the next day before I made it back to the container freight station. This time, at least as soon as we were clear, we'd crack into those containers and see if we could find any guns. I had no idea why there was a man inside, but right away, if only by the smell, I could tell the virus had gotten him as well. Mission accomplished. Looking over the crates and containers, I found shotguns, pistols, revolvers, and tons of ammunition. It wouldn't be enough to clear the entire island, not even close, but it would definitely get me started. And I knew at the airfield there was an even bigger armory. With these guns I could clear the streets, then secure the armory, and with that I had a chance of one day clearing all of Kingsmouth Island. Even as I searched the containers I could hear more zomboids inside them. With the way the containers were stacked, I would need to find a sledgehammer if I wanted to search all of them. Looking over the guns had taken all afternoon, but I still had a few hours of light to fight my way back to the cabin. I couldn't take all the guns home in one trip, but I didn't need to. Once I cleared the streets a little, and once that car was working, I'd be able to shuttle back and forth far more easily. Today was going to be different, or at least that was the plan. We had our pistol, we had our shotgun, and we had enough ammunition to make it count. My thinking was to try to keep the noise away from our base, so we were going to clear the east side of the island. Whether these things were living or dead, a shot to the head seemed to work. Fortunately, as a police officer, we were a pretty good shot. Of course, with the shotgun, it was hard to miss. It was strange to be shooting things that were walking slowly towards you. But these zomboids had no fear at all. The best way to take them out was to get them on the ground and then shoot them in the head. Most efficient way, perhaps. Like maggots coming out of a broken trash bag, each house spewed forth undead. But for the first time, it really felt like we were hunting them. Within just a few hours, the street was littered with dead. Despite the damage we were doing, they just didn't stop coming. There were plenty of hours left in the day, but I simply wasn't carrying enough ammunition to continue. So once I exhausted my supply, I made my way back to base. I'd say it had all gone very well. Rather than sneaking back and forth between my ammo dump and my base, the plan was to secure the road between the two. The Zomboids made for easy targets, and I was getting used to aiming for the head. Used properly, the shotgun could knock down whole groups. And these things were slow enough that I might be able to use that. I hadn't heard any other gunshots on the island, or seen any sign of life since that helicopter. The plan was to take out every Zomboid I could see, including ones that were trapped in buildings. For the most part, they were eager to come outside anyway. I'd fought my way all the way back to the container freight station. Even if I'd cleared it a few days ago, I'd still be careful in here. As I loaded up on fresh ammunition, I realized I hadn't brought any food along. That was unfortunate. There was a shipping office at the other end of the yard. It was worth checking out. I saw a single Zomboid standing inside, so I assumed there were plenty more. In my haste, I'd forgotten to insert a new magazine. And then my pistol jammed. Hopefully this wasn't a sign of things to come. A second jam in quick succession made me very nervous. Yep, it was an office alright. Unless it had some sort of break room, my best bet would be finding a chocolate bar in someone's desk. They were still slowly coming out. I'm not sure if they were coming out of the building or passing through it. Checking the other side, the windows were all intact, until we started shooting through them. Wherever possible, I'd try to take these things out without getting too close. But I knew sometimes I would have to get up close and personal. After clearing the building, I searched the garage. I found some more tools for my mechanics collection. I also liberated a water dispenser. The storage containers lacked all the comforts of home, but it was at least somewhere I could hide if things went bad. The water dispenser could be a lot of help, although I'd have to move some food here as well. I decided to reload all my empty magazines. And by the time I was finished, I figured it was too late to go walking all the way across town. The sleep hadn't been comfortable at all, and now I was pretty hungry. But at least I was well armed. It looks like my shooting yesterday had drawn some Zomboids up to the edge of the fence, Unable to figure out a way in, they just stood there, waiting. I'm kinda glad I didn't try just walking home in the middle of the night. When it was clear, I jumped the fence, but there was no need to head back by the beach. As much as these things were looking for me, I was looking for them. The pouring rain meant I didn't need to go tend to my farm, so as long as I could find some food in one of these houses, I'd be set. First house I checked had been for sale, so that had been no help. And the second one looked to be well occupied. I'd try to take as many out through the windows before going inside. With the ground floor clear, I stopped for some desperately needed food, even if it was only a packet of chips. I resisted the urge to drink the bottle of vegetable oil. There were more zomboids rattling doors upstairs. In one of the bedrooms I found a big hiking bag. That would help. Although now I thought about it, the military base would have plenty of large backpacks. For now though, the storm was getting worse, so I decided to make my way back to the cabin after all. This place was a mess, and getting worse day by day. I'd need a generator before I could even turn the lights on. I didn't feel like doing any more fighting in the rain, so using an umbrella I found in the last house, I decided to spend the rest of the day foraging. Maybe I'd find some food, or perhaps even some medical herbs. I had passed a small hospital in my exploration, but I wasn't too eager to go inside. Yesterday I must have done serious damage to the zombie population on the east side of this island. Now I'd try to deal with the west side. Given the number of zombies across the bridge, I decided I didn't want to fire my gun here. I decided to shout at the zomboids and get them to follow me to the north. It was a strange thing to be drawing so many of them to me at once, but at least I did have the shotgun. I'd seen plenty of packs around the gas station and the school, and that was as far north as I'd been up until now. I don't know if there were 100 of them, but there were a lot. By patiently grouping up the walking dead, I was able to fire into them with the shotgun, dealing devastating damage. Despite the absolute carnage, they just kept coming. The slaughter would continue until I ran out of zomboids or I ran out of ammunition. I still wasn't seeing any infected in military outfits, so our noise must not have been reaching the airfield. I'll say one thing, this was a lot more civilized than taking these things apart one by one with a meat cleaver. And way more effective. I'd be fine so long as I didn't let anything sneak up behind me. As the horde of walking dead continued to grow, my heart was in a constant state of panic. But I stuck to the plan. In the last 2 days I must have killed more zomboids than I had in the last month. It had taken me a lot of work to get access to these guns, but it was proving a worthwhile investment. I don't know if I'd ever be able to wander the streets freely, but at least soon I'd be able to travel quickly from place to place, at least on this half of the island. The other half was much, much worse. The main resort building alone probably held 6,000, maybe 7,000 guests. That would be an entirely different experience. Checking my watch, I saw I'd been at this for 5 hours now, and I had no idea how much longer I'd have to keep going. I wasn't getting tired, but my ears could sure use a break. I was getting in the habit of trying to shoot into the crowd with the shotgun and taking out individual zomboids with my pistol. Eventually, they stopped coming, and I was free to head further to the north. I passed another construction site. There were a few zomboids hiding inside. I'd go over it more closely later on. For now, it seemed like things I wasn't particularly interested in. I did find a bunch of fishing gear in the back of a car. That seemed useful, given we lived on an island now. I made my way further north to a Spiffos, and on the other side, I could see the fence separating us from the military airfield. The fence was topped with barbed wire, which up until now had prevented me from entering the area. I had stragglers coming at me now from all directions. The horde had been a lot smaller than the one I dealt with outside the school. When there was finally a break in the fighting, I decided to check out a nearby taxi that looked to be in good condition. Popping the hood, I saw that it indeed was in much better condition than the car we'd already stolen. It had gas too, so when I found there was a key in the ignition, I took it. I still wasn't a very good driver, but I'm sure it'd come in handy anyway. There were plenty of hours of daylight left, but I'd had enough. I'd done enough. Even in nightmares, I'd never imagined so many dead. It was nice to stand by the ocean, looking over my growing crops. Some of the tomatoes were ripe, so were some of the broccoli. Without power, there was no refrigeration, but I was pretty hungry, so it should be okay. The tips I'd picked up in that farming book were really helping out. I'd have to read another book soon. I was tempted to do that today when a fog rolled in, but the thought of finding a generator gave me fresh purpose. I decided to drive up to the freight station, and I was intent on checking the rest of these containers, or at least the ones I could reach. I had to do some more building to get to the ones on the second floor. It didn't pay off unless I really wanted a pool table. At least they'd give me some easy construction supplies. After smashing down the last of the doors, the Zomboid lunged out of the darkness at me. It wasn't wholly unexpected, but certainly unexplained. I found some hunting magazines. Maybe they'd be useful, although fishing did seem to be the better option. Returning to the ground floor, I started to take out the rest of the doors. I was mentally prepared to find zomboids inside now. In fact, I could hear them growling. This one seemed to have bashed his face against the door for so long that he didn't have a face left. Definitely not alive. Lots of boxes, but would I get lucky? I could really use a sledgehammer. I crossed my fingers as I searched the last container. Some more fishing gear, books, paintbrush. No luck. I drove back to the cabin and spent the rest of the evening reading. Beginning my quest for a sledgehammer in earnest, I decided to check some of the larger sheds in the area. I'd passed by an impressive mansion several times now. I was hoping the garage would be well stocked. As I got closer, I was expecting zomboids to start hurling themselves through the glass windows, but I only saw one inside. When I stepped inside, I did see a second one, but it was already dead. Slipping into the garage, I began checking the shelves. Lots of tools, lots of weapons. This would have been a gold mine up until a few days ago. I could always make space for another crowbar. In frustration, I emptied out the cabinets. Aside from another hand axe, I was out of luck. No sledgehammer. Heading into the house, I found more dead zomboids. I poked a few of them to see if they were playing possum, but they were dead. I didn't have enough medical training to figure out what had happened. Maybe another survivor had gotten to them. It was just before noon now, so I drove north, intent on clearing the north side of town. That should be the last of the prep work I needed to do before heading out onto the airfield. This was the same area I was fighting in yesterday, but there was still plenty of zomboids about. As before, shotgun worked wonders. I'd replaced my damaged vest a few days ago, but I was always keeping an eye out for spares. Walking right up to the barbed wire fence, I found a group of zomboids seemingly stuck on the other side. They wanted to get me, but they couldn't figure out how. I could shoot them just fine. It was later than I'd like, but I felt like I'd been putting it off for days. It's not like the military zombies were going to shoot at me or anything, and there couldn't be more than a couple of hundred out here. A week ago that would have been intimidating, but now I just had to stay calm and keep doing what I was doing. Fighting on the airfield gave them very little chance of sneaking up behind me. I wouldn't be able to clear the whole area today, but I was hoping to at least find a military backpack. By the time I saw a serviceman wearing a good-sized backpack, I had zomboids coming at me from all directions. I grabbed the backpack and made a break for it. I'd probably drag a few of these things out in the town, but that was tomorrow's problem. Getting in the car, I drove south past the fire station and the police station, and then past the massacre outside the school. Even now, there were still more of these things just standing around. Even heading back to the cabin, I stayed cautious. I tried to take them out quietly, or at least more quietly than using a shotgun. With my destination in reach, a tingle ran up my spine. I whipped around, but I couldn't see anything. It took another few heartbeats before I saw a zomboid come staggering out of the jungle. Cautious, always cautious. While I was at the container yard, I saw they had a shipment of generators waiting on the dock. Unfortunately, I couldn't get into them without a sledgehammer. I decided to return to the local school, in case it had some sort of workshop. There were just a few zomboids outside, and they were easy to handle now that I was well armed. Slipping into the school, I knew I had to look for some sort of custodial space, or perhaps a student workshop. In a sports storeroom, I found a large collection of baseball bats. That would have been real useful a few weeks ago. I hadn't cleared this building, but with all the noise I've been making recently, I didn't expect there'd be too many zomboids hiding inside. I found what looked like an art teacher, and bashed it, hit him with a hammer. I was glad there weren't any children here. That would have been creepy. The food in the cafeteria had rotted weeks ago. I'd been practicing my electrical skills here and there, and soon I'd be able to move an oven back to the cabin. Heading upstairs, I was prepared for a rush of zomboids, but it was quiet. Almost too quiet. I found a welder's mask, which I'd need at some point, but it wasn't a priority now. Right now I wasn't searching every single desk or locker, I was just looking for that sledgehammer, though I did poke about a bit more out of sheer curiosity. I ended up finding a large room that looked like some sort of workshop. This was exactly what I was looking for. It was just a question of whether or not it had what I wanted. More tools, more radios. Nothing. I would have to look elsewhere. There were 2 lighthouses on Kingsmouth Island, and I hadn't had a chance to visit either during my holiday. I was still slowly clearing the zomboids off the island, and there was a chance there'd be a sledgehammer there anyway, so it wouldn't be a waste. Still not sure about the sledgehammer, but the peninsula definitely had its share of zomboids. With growing confidence, I tried to be more efficient in how I dealt with them. I did my best to group them up before taking them out with a shotgun. The house was isolated and much nicer than our little cabin, but nowhere near as secure. Still, it would be nice to live somewhere that didn't feel like I was camping. It sounded clear, but I checked the place out anyway. I was surprised to find a few guns, although not in very good condition. With the guns and some canned food in my bag, I decided to check out the lighthouse itself. No zomboids and no sledgehammer. But I've got to say, the view was worth it. Kingsmouth Island was a beautiful place, and I had it all to myself. Driving back into town, I thought a more reasonable place to look would be the local fire station. It was a small thing attached to the police station. Both would be worth checking out. It never failed to shock me when I saw these things walking around with weapons impaled all the way through them. After a few bursts of the shotgun, bodies started pouring out of the fire station. I was close enough to the airfield to start expecting bodies to be coming from that direction as well. Inside I could hear more zomboids, but I could also see shelves filled with tools. More weapons, more tools, even an empty gas can. No sledgehammer. While I was here, I figured I'd check out the police station as well. A month ago it would have felt so wrong to be shooting at other police, but now I could look at these things as they were, as monsters. Searching the bodies, I found a key that would get me into the armory. It would be a humble thing compared to what they had at the airfield. The poor cousin or not, it still had at least 20 boxes of shotgun shells. I definitely had enough ammunition to fight my way into the armory on the airfield, and from there, to clear the whole of Kingsmouth Island. But for now, the shadows were lengthening, and I wanted to get back to the cabin to check on my farm. Looking over my map, I updated it with the most recent areas I'd searched. The mansion, police station, the firehouse. None had what I needed. Someone would have a sledgehammer in a closet, somewhere. That would mean going door to door through the entire town. I set off that morning intent on finally clearing the airfield, but when I spotted a few zomboids wandering the streets, I followed them and found a larger group had formed on the east side of town. And while fighting them, I seemed to have provoked whatever had been hiding in the hospital. The dead poured out of the nearby row houses. It was a large group, but not larger than I could handle. Just reload and fire, you couldn't miss. When zomboids started flooding in from all directions, things got a little more dicey. 500 in front of me would be better than 50 in front and 50 behind, so I ran around till I gathered them all up. My heart pounded, the shotgun kicked, and the zomboids died. When I saw the message painted on the wall of the hospital, I was doubtful to say the least, but as a police officer, I felt I had to investigate. Most of what was in here had probably just come out to fight me in the street, but I knew to expect a few infected hiding in bathrooms, or storerooms. I didn't know much about first aid, but I figure if I needed anything, it would be here. It didn't make sense to move it all back to the cabin. Maybe later. For now, I kept following the sound of moans and rattling doors. Another storeroom, more medical supplies, as expected. Perhaps I'd find a janitor's closet, or an area under construction. At no point did I really expect to find anyone alive inside. Good job, sandbag barricade. Doing God's work. When I killed an infected banging its head against the bathroom stall, the hospital fell silent. Hopefully that was the last one. There was a helipad out on the roof. Maybe that chopper I'd heard had come from here. Could anyone really have escaped this? Would they still have the virus? In the end, the hospital had contained only what I expected. Medical supplies and the dead. It was depressing. Depressing enough that I felt like calling it a day. I made my way back to the car and headed back to the cabin. The little island didn't even smell of death anymore. The next day, my trip to the military airfield was once again cut short. Dozens of zomboids were on or lingering near the bridge to the other side of the island. I knew I had to do something about that. I just hadn't got around to it. I had plenty of tools now. I just needed the time. Fighting these things just a dozen at a time didn't even make me panic anymore. It was late in the day by the time I was done. Too late to continue on to the airfield. Rather than head home with little to show for it, I decided to take what I could from the dead. I had some tailoring books. It made sense to start gathering supplies. There was a fog the next morning, so rather than head back out, I picked up a needle and started practicing some tailoring. I didn't have a ton of supplies, or even the best material to work with, but now that I'd gotten started, I could keep my eyes open for more. When the fog broke, I picked up a crowbar and made my way back to the bridge. It was time to do something about it. I didn't need to create anything permanent or unbreakable, just something to deter zomboids from wandering onto this half of the island. It was hard work using the crowbar to move the heavy concrete blocks. I remembered that there were plenty of big steel barrels back in the warehouse, so I moved them to the bridge as well. It took quite a few hours, but eventually I was done. All it had to do was convince the wandering dead to wander somewhere else. With that done, I made my way back to the cabin and did a little bit more tailoring. A tropical storm had blown in sometime during the night. That would limit my options for the day. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, so going off and fighting zomboids was out of the question. I moved the taxi into the warehouse, along with the other car I'd been working on. Trying my best to stay out of the rain, I made some repairs to the warehouse and shored up its defenses. And that was it for the day. I didn't want to fight or even explore in this weather, so I made my way back to the cabin. The storm didn't ease off. If anything, it got even stronger. I was safe in the sturdy old cabin as the island trees bent in the howling wind. By the time the storm broke, I'd gone through all of my self-help books, so I made my way back to the school to steal some more. I was a little surprised to see infected standing in the hallway, but I didn't have to deal with them now. I quickly searched the library and grabbed what I needed. I didn't see any infected on my way out, but I'm sure we'd bump into each other sooner or later. The storm had distracted me from my search for a sledgehammer. Now that the storm had passed, I got back to work. I could have checked the airfield for tools, but instead I decided to search the first of the 4 row houses in the centre of town. The streets around the hospital were still empty, so after giving a quick once-over, I started entering the buildings one by one. Rather than going in quietly, I made enough noise to wake the dead. Moans and rattling doors gave away their position. I still preferred fighting outside, but at least I had a new bulletproof vest to wear. As I moved from house to house, I kept an eye out for anything useful, but the goal was a sledgehammer. Upon finding a room full of cardboard boxes, I let myself get excited, but it wasn't to be. Another empty house was stuffed full with cardboard boxes. It would take me a while to search them. The best I found was some books, maybe some fertilizer that could be useful. I'd seen these zomboids hurl themselves out of second-story windows, but some of them seemed content to hide in their old homes. My hope was that any group of 2 or more infected would have smashed their way out into the street. It took most of the day, but eventually I made it to the end of the row. Another room full of cardboard boxes, and once again I let myself hope. A sledgehammer would let me access a generator, and that would let me have light at my base and refrigeration. Civilization, in short. I was impressed that this house was actually more decrepit than my cabin, although to be fair, we were both using a cot for a bed. More boxes, more disappointment. I pulled out my map and marked off the whole building. There were certainly things here that might be useful later, but nothing I needed right now. I would have to try elsewhere. My cabin was a total mess. Empty cans, scraps of cloth, and electrical supplies littered the floor. I headed out for the day. I wanted to head straight to the airfield, but I thought it would be best to give this side of the island a sweep. Piles of dead remained where they fell, but it seemed as if more infected had made their way out onto the streets. At some point I would exhaust their numbers. With a practiced calm, I gathered the street together. When the time came, I sprung the trap. The noise brought in more of the walking dead, but that just meant I didn't have to go looking for them. I moved from the east side of town to the north side of town to find more zomboids waiting. I was culling infected in a parking lot when a door broke and zomboids in lab coats began to pour out onto the street. These buildings were shops of some sort, but I hadn't been in there yet. I guess one of them must have been a pharmacy. Since I was so close to my ammo dump, I decided to head in and restock. By the time I'd reloaded all my magazines and filled my backpack, it was dark, so I decided to head back to the cabin. I would head out to the airfield tomorrow. I got up early so I could work on the farm before heading out to the airfield. I didn't want to get distracted again. I decided to take the taxi, just in case I had a lot of loot to bring home. I honked the car's horn as I made my way across the airstrip. Might as well get started. Even in this light rain, 300 infected shouldn't be a problem. Rather than waiting to group them up, I fired off my shotgun a few times. Might as well really let them know I'm here. It didn't take long for quite a crowd to assemble. Looking back at the shambling horde was enough to get my heart racing. Things would be okay, as long as nothing went wrong. It's a good thing the infected weren't a little faster. I was getting better at this. I could fire and reload so rapidly I could drop bodies on the same spot. In theory, there was plenty of ammunition in the nearby guard towers, but in practice I couldn't go up into any of those towers while the infected were wandering the airfield. It would be too risky to have them swarm up after me. No matter how many times I emptied the shotgun, when I turned around there always seemed to be 30 or 40 zomboids following me. The rain let up just before noon, and I think the number of infected was starting to dwindle. I kept looking over my shoulder nervously as I made my way up into one of the guard towers. There were 5 or 6 of these things around the perimeter of the airfield. It looked clear. None of the electronics were working, and I couldn't even get the door to open. But there was enough ammunition to make up for all that I'd used that morning, and more. I made my way into the first of the large hangars. There wasn't as much storage for tools as I'd hoped. Maybe they stored them elsewhere. To the south of me were the military accommodation and maybe some offices. If I could find a map of the facility, that would be useful. For now, I'd just check the next hangar. I found another hand axe, which would be useful, but it wasn't a sledgehammer. Heading back out towards the runway, I saw a dozen or so zomboids come closer, but as I fought them, more continued to arrive. I had maybe 3 or 4 hours of light left once I finished dealing with the walking dead. I found a block of offices with a control tower, and what I thought was a military warehouse. Entering the warehouse, I almost tripped over a generator. In theory, I was looking for a sledgehammer, but that was only so I could access a generator at the freight terminal. I was feeling real good as I snuck up behind a zomboid and jammed a knife at her brain. There were some boxes and crates here as well, but it almost didn't matter what was in them. It would have been nice to find a sledgehammer as well, but I had no such luck. It would take some effort to get the generator back to the cabin, but it would be manageable, especially with the car waiting. Rather than take the generator all the way back to the cabin, I dropped it off at the nearby gas station. I'd learned how to set up the generator from one of the books I found at the school. I hooked it up at the gas station to get the gas pumps working again. I'd managed to collect a few empty gas cans, and I was careful as I filled them up one by one. I couldn't pump gas without the generator, and I couldn't have the generator at the gas station and at the cabin. It looked like I'd have to keep my eye out for a second. It took a few trips to move all the gas cans and the generator onto the island. I even had to disassemble the barricade for a while. I didn't leave it down for long. Perhaps the only thing that was keeping me sane were those moments where I could relax and let my guard down on the island. The generator was just the next step in making it more livable. With the generator I'd get lights, refrigeration, and an oven. It had been a long time coming, and I was glad it was done. It was nice to hear the little fridge come to life. I didn't have a lot of fresh food, but if I could freeze it, I could start growing a lot more. And now that I had some light, maybe I could clean this place up. I'd got my weight back up to a healthy level. I still wanted to find time to practice fishing. Maybe I could take a few days off soon. I'd looted a fishing guide ages ago, but I'd never gotten around to reading it. It took me most of the morning. As I read the book, I realized we may have had power, but I could definitely use a few more lights around here. After lunch, I left the cabin, still cautious despite my growing confidence. I made my way over to the warehouse, but I spotted a few zomboids loitering in the woods nearby. I'd liberated an old M14 from the airfield, and while a shotgun seemed to be the right tool for taking out hordes of these things, the rifle's long reach was convenient. Heading into the warehouse, I began to look for things that had not interested me on earlier visits. Several bags of plaster, right where I'd left them. 5 bags should be enough to do the small cabin. Slowed down by the heavy bags, I made my way back home. It was late enough that I didn't feel like starting any long jobs. Instead, I went out fishing for the evening. I had a fishing rod and a handful of worms, but it was just easier to spin time forward using a spear. As much as I felt like staying home and fishing for the day, I decided to head out on another sweep. It seemed like every few days more infected would find their way out onto the street. The rifle did a good job of clearing them out without me having to group them all up. I'd become a pretty good shot over the last month. Few people ever got so much practice on live targets. I'd finished my sweep by noon, so I decided to check a few houses. I was starting to keep an eye out for things I might want to take home to the cabin, though my primary concern was still lingering infected. By the end of the day, I'd checked off a few more houses. A thick fog in the morning meant I spent a few hours fishing. I had enough practice now that I needed some more tips. I'd read another book later. It was early in the afternoon when I left the island. This time I was looking for one specific thing. Not a generator, not a sledgehammer, but a paintbrush. I know I'd seen one somewhere, but I couldn't remember where. So I began to retrace my steps. Nothing in the warehouse, so perhaps the school. I found a new fishing book, but no paintbrush. I still hadn't searched through every single desk, but if I'd seen a paintbrush earlier, it wouldn't have been there. There was something creepy about the abandoned school, so I was glad to be out of there. I racked my brain for where else I might have seen a paintbrush. I remembered the largest mansion in town had a big garage. Maybe there'd been a paintbrush there. Nothing. I'd even thought to check the garbage bin. While I was at the mansion, I used a screwdriver to steal some of the external lamps. It'd be nice to light up the inside and outside of the cabin. I went north, already feeling drowsy. I found some zomboids, but it was light work taking them out with the pistol. I still hadn't checked these stores, but that also meant I hadn't seen a paintbrush there. It was very late, and I was still searching the container terminal, when, at last, I came upon a paintbrush. Such a little thing, and it had cost me a whole day. I guess with all of my preparations, I could afford to waste the day. My side of the island was quiet for a few days, so I spent the time fishing and working on my car. I was actually looking forward to working on the cabin, although I didn't have that many nails to work with. One place I thought I might be able to find some nails was the wharf on the other side of the island. It had been nearly 2 months since I'd been on this side of the island. I knew it wasn't going to be pretty. I'd hoped to sneak around the large packs of infected. Instead, I almost knocked one to the ground when I ran into him. I was running past the construction site, but I couldn't stop to search. Even without firing a single gun, Zomboid seemed to be closing in on me from all directions. Maybe I should have retraced my steps along the river. My plan was to head back up to the bungalows and get on familiar ground. Running almost blind through the trees was very uncomfortable. I had to hop the fence into the driving range, and I really needed to make it in the first try. I was breathing heavy by the time I left the driving range, and I realized I'd have to slow down. I decided to fire off a few rounds from my rifle. If the infected started heading this way, that was fine. I wasn't sticking around. I thought that maybe the population would be low enough that I could thin it out with my pistol. That turned out not to be the case. I'd packed a lot of ammunition, but not enough to keep this up. I couldn't stick around and fight, and I didn't want to waste the last of my ammunition. Things didn't start going any smoother as I made my way along the coast to the wharf. There were too many zomboids on the beach, so I had to cut into the jungle. There were just too many to fight, and if I started shooting, I'd have hundreds on me in minutes. If too many followed me out onto the wharf, I could get in real trouble. I'd forgot about this generator. It would be useful, but too difficult to carry all the way home. I'd searched this area long ago, but then I was mostly looking for weapons and tools, not boxes of nails. It was highly likely that I'd left behind many things that I would now find useful. Even the paint might be nice, though it was too heavy to risk carrying home. It was still early enough in the day, and I seemed to have shaken any pursuit, so I tore apart several of the crates to get planks and nails. It didn't take long for me to build a staircase behind the shipping containers. There was a container on the second level that I couldn't reach. I had no idea what was in it, but I was going to check. It turned out to have fridges inside, a lot of fridges, and freezers. They weren't totally useless, but I wasn't running across half of Kingsmouth Island with a fridge on my back. Seeing as I had a generator and a nearby source of gas, I thought maybe I could start work on a small outpost over here. It turned out a group of zomboids had followed me to the edge of the wharf, though they seemed to have lost interest. It was late enough now that I knew I was going to spend the night over here, so I made a point of refilling my water bottles. If I was going to sleep here, a sturdy bench would be better than nothing at all. It lacked all of the comforts of home, but I should be safe till morning. I knew there was a construction site nearby, and it probably had plenty of boxes of nails in it. It was unlikely that I was going to be able to sneak in, but it was worth a try. The important thing was to know when to cut and run. With zomboids blocking the waterline, I made my way through the building. I knew I couldn't fire my guns here, and even attempting to take out a few of the infected proved fruitless. For every one I killed, 2 more quickly appeared. The plan was to try to lure the infected away from the construction site, but the forest made that extremely difficult. I couldn't make sure the infected were following me, and too many of them weren't. After an hour of trying to lead them away, I realized it was never going to work. I fled back through the building. After catching my breath, I knew it was time to head home. Rather than heading through familiar territory, I decided I would scout the southern side of the island. Was it as bad as I expected? I'd find out. I knew I had to stay away from the main resort building. The moment I jumped the fence, they were onto me, and in large packs. Though I gained nothing from it, and I knew I couldn't stay for more than a moment, I finally set my eyes on the second lighthouse on Kingsmouth Island. One day I'd be back this way, and I'd clear out all these infected. I'd gained nothing more than a couple of boxes of nails, but so long as I didn't lead a few hundred of these infected back to my side of the island, I'd call it a win. The old rotten walls of the cabin wouldn't take plaster or paint, so I was going to have to replace all of them. Finally, I had the tools and all the materials I'd need, so it was time to get to work. I'd still only ever found hand axes, but they were enough to fell a few trees and make some planks. 2 planks, 4 nails, take your hammer, and just like that. The wall looked much as it had, but now I could plaster it and then paint it. If I was going to have to live here for however long, I was going to turn this cabin into a real home. As I worked, I made some minor adjustments, moving a window here, a door there. From the front window, I had a perfect view of the bridge and my little barricade. The first day had been long and tiring, and I knew it would take a few more days to get this all done, and even that would only be the beginning. Up until now, I'd never even considered removing the boards from these windows. As I took out the walls in my bedroom, I realized I should have stolen a nicer bed a long, long time ago. I decided to move the back door a little further away from where I would sleep. It felt good to really take advantage of all the hard work I'd put into learning carpentry. And now I was finally ready to read the last of my carpentry books. With so little left to do, I wasn't going to wait for that though. The outside of the cabin was looking real good, but I'd need to head back into town to get some more furniture for the inside. It had been quite a while since I'd crossed into town, so I was expecting infected, and I was not disappointed. Compared to what I'd seen on the other side of the island, this felt almost casual. As I cleared the last group on the western side of town, I realized the only way I was going to get the infected to stop coming out of the jungle was if I went and turned off respawn in the sandbox settings. So I did. After clearing the streets, I took advantage of the calm and finally stole my cabin a new bed. It had been 2 months since the Knox virus came to Kingsmouth Island, and I had survived. I was a survivor. I had no idea how long it would take me to clear the rest of Kingsmouth Island, but I didn't want to do it while squatting in a dark log cabin. I hadn't even fought my way to the armory at the airfield, nor had I even begun to consider how I would deal with the thousands and thousands of zomboids at the resort. That could wait though. It could all wait. I was well set up here now, and could proceed at my leisure. The sea and the sky and the forest would provide. For now, I'd finish decorating this place, and then maybe I'd do a little more fishing. Not bad. Not bad at all. We're still alive, and still not bitten. What more can any of us ask for than that? Well, that was 2 months and 2,000 zombies. I hope you've enjoyed the adventures of Officer Harris McLean. Well, this was my first foray into this format. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoyed it. You all have a great day, and may 2024 be your year.